We're joined, as we are each month, by local government expert and attorney Chris Hand. Chris, good morning.
Good morning, Ann.
It's wonderful to have you here, and there is so much to talk about as ever. But let's start, if we can, with this special election. Competitive in a way that nobody really expected in a reliably red district. It kind of includes southern St. Johns County and portions south there.
Competitive in a not competitive seat, Ann, and not to put too fine a point on it, but this was a district that President Trump won by 30 percentage points in November, just a few months ago during the presidential election. And now there is new polling, Florida Politics publication, statewide online publication commissioned a poll from St. Pete Polls, which has shown this race potentially within the margin of error. It showed the Republican candidate Randy Fine with 48%. And his opponent Josh Weil with 44%. So a surprisingly close race, one in which the Democratic candidate, and this is again not something that typically happens in this district, has raised about $10 million to just over 500,000 for the Republican candidate. Look, the odds still very much favor the Republican winning this seat. It's just a very kind of Republican leaning seat. But the fact that it is so close and so competitive is causing people around the country to take notice and pay very close attention to what the final results will be next Tuesday, April the 1st, when voters go to the polls.
And you note an enormous amount of money already being spent on this race. Um, I'm interested if we know kind of where the Democratic money is coming from, and then also, I guess we're learning that even just this week, the GOP has really stepped up its efforts to infuse some cash, including from Elon Musk, into the Republican side of this contest.
Well, it's interesting. We're seeing this phenomenon in both special congressional elections in Florida, and there are two here, Congressional District 6, as you say, which includes parts of Central and Northeast Florida. This is the seat that National Security Advisor Mike Walz previously held before he took that position in the administration. His departure from Congress opened that, and it's created the race we're talking about. There's also a contest going on in the Panhandle, the first congressional district. This was the seat that Matt Gaetz previously occupied before he resigned from Congress. Two candidates there. The Republican is the chief financial officer of Florida, Jimmy Patronis. This is one where there's less concern on the Republican side because this is an even more Republican district, sort of a plus 37 Republican district,
Mm.
but also one where you're seeing a significant financial disparity. The one in that race, the Republican has raised about $1 million, the Democrat about $6 million.
Wow.
I haven't done a full analysis of where these contributions are coming from, but I suspect what you're seeing is a lot. These special elections are ways for Democrats around the country, particularly low dollar Democratic donors around the country, to express some of the frustration they're feeling right now about the direction of the Trump administration, direction of the company, maybe even frustration at their own leaders in Congress, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks. There aren't as many ways to do that in March of an odd-numbered year. These particular special elections have proved to be a vehicle for people to, get engaged through their contributions. I suspect we'll see this even more a little bit later this year in a special congressional election in New York. Elise Stefanik, who's a member from New York, is going to be leaving Congress to take the job of United Nations ambassador. Her nomination is still pending. That's a much closer congressional district than the ones in Florida, so we're likely to see that phenomenon there as well. But in an odd-numbered year, there just aren't that many opportunities for voters and donors to get involved. The two special elections here in Florida are two of those rare opportunities, so you're seeing a lot of engagement both in the district, in the state, and around the country.
So Randy Fine, who's the Republican in this race, he's still a state senator. He serves as the chair of the Committee on Governmental Oversight and Accountability. He had a hearing yesterday. He actually sounded like maybe he was a little bit grumpy. Take a listen to what he had to say.
You're done too. Next, 30 seconds.
Yeah,
Come
30
on up.
seconds is disgusting.
Yeah,
Y'all-
well, yeah. Enjoy your terrorist rag. Come on, let's go. You're next. I'm the chairman. I can say what I want. If you don't like it, you can leave. Come on. You're next.
You get paid by us.
I'll clear the room, and then we can move on if I hear one more outburst. I don't have to have any of you sit here. One more. I'll clear the room. We'll debate, and we'll vote.
So he was at that point kind of earning some boos from people in the audience. He was addressing a speaker who was wearing this traditional Middle Eastern headdress kind of around his shoulders, called it a terrorist rag. Um, he has been getting a lot of pushback from Republicans because of his lack of fundraising and perhaps lack of, you know, uh, um, urgency on the campaign trail. And so people being quoted off the record talking about, wishing that he was doing more, that they wanted him to um, be more involved, but they didn't ultimately think that he was going to lose this.
I think the consensus is, again, just because of how district is drawn, how the Republican advantage in registration, he's likely to win. But you are pointing out, an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing right now. If this race is closer than expected, and closer than expected would be really anything less than that 30% margin that Donald Trump won. And of course, Mike Walz was reelected by a similar margin. When Governor Ron DeSantis represented this district in Congress, or a very similar district, he typically won by very significant margins in the general election. I think one of the strategies you're seeing around the country is what Republicans don't want is this interpreted as somehow a commentary on President Trump and his first, 60 days in office at this point. And I think there will be an effort, if this race or the one in the Panhandle runs closer, to suggest that that means the Trump administration is in some political trouble. And frankly, polling suggests that that may be the case. A lot of what's happening right now is unpopular. But we already see sort of a circling of the wagons effect here, where a variety of people nationally are saying, no, this isn't about President Trump. This is about a candidate who hasn't run as an effective a campaign as he can, hasn't raised as much money as he can. So you're already seeing fingers pointed at the Republican candidate, Randy Fine, not just for a potential loss, but a potential win that is less overwhelming than expected. There's clear effort trying to make sure that this is not painted as about President Trump, but about a candidate they feel like who has not been as productive as he could be.
And certainly the governor has joined that conversation. He's been pointing out that he won that district by the same wide margin that President Trump won it by. And he actually said this is not a reflection of President Trump. It's a reflection of a specific candidate running in that race, saying it was a huge underperformance.
Well, and I think also worth pointing out, there is no love lost between Governor DeSantis and Randy Fine. They've had a complicated relationship for much of the time they've been in Tallahassee together. Senator Fine was a DeSantis supporter until during the presidential campaign, he very sort of publicly broke with the governor and joined the Trump campaign. So again, this is
And he has been endorsed by Trump.
Correct. Yeah, and had multiple messages come from President Trump, sort of supporting his campaign. But I think when you've seen some of that commentary from around the country, one of the themes you've seen is that again, that there's concern that there hasn't been enough fundraising, there hasn't been enough activity, and the Trump political machine is having to get involved. I think one of the quotes was to sort of drag the candidate across the finish line, and so we'll see kind of what the final result is. I think one thing that seems clear at this point is it's going to be significantly closer than it was in November, which in a district that is leaning this much toward one particular party is a surprising result. And people around the country will attempt to interpret that in a variety of ways.
Could be a win that's kind of seen as a loss.
Right.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand. He joins us every month to talk about the latest state and local headlines, and you can join our conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937 or email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out on social media. Got a call from Wells on the South Side. Good morning, Wells. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann. Good morning, Ann and Chris. I was in that chamber Tuesday. It was packed with people who, for one of the pieces of legislation, there were a number of them, but one of those pieces was to protect Confederate statues. And Randy Fine, he had to leave, but he was very disrespectful to the Floridians who were in that chamber. We ran the clock out on them, so they could not vote to push this piece of legislation forward. So they want to protect Confederate statues. They would like to put them back up. And I just want to say I'm going to be at the IBEW Hall tonight to see the movie Union because I am a retired union member of two different unions. And I want to say this last thing about Randy Fine. I wanted to ask him, and I wanted to say to him that he's a believer in the false ideology of white supremacy. And I want him to know that that's what I am saying about him when I speak about him. I want to thank you.
Thanks, Wells. It was a contentious meeting. We know that he was limiting speakers to about 30 seconds, and so that never goes over very well when people have traveled all the way to Tallahassee to have their voices heard. But I want to move on, if we can, to some voter changes that have been some proposed, some that have been approved at the state and the local level. Starting with some changes that state lawmakers want to make to alter the ballot initiative process. What's going on there?
Well, as you know, Ann, in recent years, there has been an effort from a variety of perspectives to change the way Floridians can actually sort of propose and adopt amendments to the Florida Constitution. This started as far back as 2006. It used to be that we wanted to pass a constitutional amendment in the state. It was a simple majority, 50% plus one. In 2006, there was an amendment on the ballot that elevated that standard from 50% plus one to 60% plus one. So that's been the law, essentially since 2007. There's been concern, particularly by legislators over time, that there are too many amendments, that maybe that process needs to be reformed. So there are some proposed changes this year that would make it harder, and this is in keeping with other changes that have been adopted in recent years, that make it harder to circulate and collect petitions for placing a constitutional amendment on the ballot. Remember, there are two ways under the state constitution to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot. The legislature can do so directly with a supermajority vote of both houses of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and citizens can do so themselves by circulating petitions, going through a Supreme Court review process, and then ultimately having voters choose that. Now, that is the one way citizens have under the Constitution to directly affect the laws. Obviously, we live in a representative democracy, so people can elect their leaders and advocate to their leaders. But in terms of directly affecting the course of Florida law, the best way citizens can do that through the constitutional amendment process. So these proposed changes have generated significant controversy by citizens who've said, look, there are already restrictions on our ability to do this. Why would we want to change this any further? People who have advocated for some of these changes, which include things like having to post $1 million bond if you're a petition gatherer, limiting petition collection and gathering to Florida residents, requiring sort of verification of signatures from the supervisor of elections, and a variety of other things. Those who are critics of that say, look, a lot of these changes aren't needed. The system's sort of already working. In fact, case in point, two very popular amendments didn't make it into the state constitution last fall because of that 60% standard. And this, the critics are saying, this is taking away a right that we have to put things on the ballot. Proponents are saying, look, there's opportunities for fraud in this process or other ways to interfere with the election process. We've got to streamline them and minimize the number of people from out of state who are involved in this process. But this is a bill that is moving through the legislature right now.
Is this a territorial type issue for lawmakers who just would prefer to make the laws themselves? Or is there some evidence that there has been fraud or, issues of concern in previous amendment efforts?
I don't think there's been widespread consensus that there have been some of these challenges in past elections. I mean, the Florida elections process, for the most part, has generally gotten very good reviews in sort of recent years. And again, I mean, last year's election being a good example, there were multiple constitutional amendments on the ballot. The two most high profile were Amendment 3, which would have legalized small amounts of recreational marijuana, and Amendment 4, which would have restored kind of a reproductive rights, abortion rights to the Florida Constitution. Those were both very popular, passed with more than a majority support, but are not part of the Florida Constitution because they did not reach that 60% threshold. So I think the concern on the part of some is that this is sort of an over belt and suspenders approach to dealing with this process that might limit the ability of citizens to engage in the process. So we'll have to watch this, but I think that's certainly a question that's going to be asked as this bill goes through. What's the evidence that this is actually a problem? What impact might this have on citizens' ability to affect their own constitution? And we'll have to track that as this bill moves through the process.
At the federal level, there are also some changes. Donald Trump signed an executive action on Tuesday that are going to have some impacts on basically people who are trying to register to vote, including requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote. That's basically what, like a passport, a birth certificate?
Well, it could be a variety of things. It could be a passport. And remember, about half of Americans do not have passports. It could be what's called real ID, which most of us have here in the state of Florida, ID that's been issued after a driver's license agency has reviewed proof of citizenship, like a birth certificate. It could be a birth certificate. There are large numbers of citizens out there. The Brennan Center for Justice at New York University did a study a couple of years ago. I think it was up to about 20% of citizens of voting age don't have ready access to some of those proofs of citizenship, whether it's a birth certificate or a passport or real ID. Here in Florida, most of us have real ID. It's mandatory to have it.
Is that sort of part of our driver's license?
Exactly right. But in many states, that is not mandatory. And so you have large numbers of people who might have driver's licenses, but they are not what's called real ID compliant. So
Mm.
I think there's a variety after President Trump, issued this executive order. There was a variety of concerns. Of course, one of the things he said in the executive order was, I'm going to ban, anyone from registering to vote who, doesn't have proof of citizenship. I think one reason you're going to see a court challenge to this is because the Constitution makes it very clear that states, not the federal government, are the level of government that oversee election, particularly the time, place, and manner of elections. Congress can regulate, of course, federal elections, and there is a bill pending in Congress called the SAVE Act, which would, impose a similar citizenship requirement. And of course, right now, most states do require some form of identification to actually go vote to kind of cast your ballot. So again, president sort of wading into an area that traditionally the courts have said Congress can regulate federal elections, but the states regulate their own elections. Also, in the executive order he issued was a mandate that all ballots be received by election day. Right now, most states do that, but there are 18 states plus Puerto Rico that if your ballot is postmarked by election day and received, during a period thereafter, it counts. Again, the Constitution's been pretty clear, and courts have been clear in enforcing that in the past, that states regulate that time, place, and manner of elections, and that's not in the purview of federal government. So, again, another executive order that's been issued, but there are going to be a lot of questions about its legality, and it's certainly going to have a judicial challenge.
Um, the city council had some big movement in the last like week or so, and I want to start with a legal issue that they've been looking at, which is their own general counsel, the attorney that represents both the city council and then the office that basically represents. Well, I'll let you explain it because it is an unusual situation for an attorney, kind of how they represent the city. But explain to us what happened, what the council voted for.
Sure, and just to remind people, we have a unique Office of General Counsel. Obviously, City of Jacksonville and Duval County consolidated in 1968, and one of the reforms that came out of consolidation was rather than having each different arm of city government have its own attorney, they are all represented by the same law firm, for lack of a better term. That's the Office of General Counsel. It's one of the largest public law firms in the state, if not the country, among cities. And the Office of General Counsel represents everyone in consolidated government. So the mayor's a client, the city council's a client, each of the five constitutional officers and the school board is a client, the independent authorities are a client. Well, and in addition to representing clients, the general counsel has what's called binding legal authority. So if there is a conflict between or among different city of Jacksonville agencies, the general counsel operates sort of as a quasi judge and can sort of make rulings about this is what city law is, and those rulings are definitive. There has been controversy over the last year or two where city council, and this is, by the way, this is not the first time a city council has expressed concern about this related to a general counsel. You've seen it in multiple periods in our city's history. They believe the general counsel. They've argued that the general counsel is not independent, that he's biased in favor of the mayor, that he's making rulings that lean too much in favor of the mayor, and they, as a result, they had this no confidence resolution to suggest that he wasn't sufficiently independent. That passed with an 11-6 vote the other night. Again, this is not an uncommon sort of charge that's been made against general counsels in the past. By nature of their role, general counsels spend a lot of time with the mayor's office and the executive departments that represent the mayor because they run the day-to-day kind of roles of city government. The flashpoint here was something we talked about in one of our last conversations, Anne, was a ruling on Meridian Waste and its contract and a ruling about separation of powers that concerned a number of members of general counsel. They introduced this no confidence resolution and it passed. Now, just to be clear, this is non-binding. It has no force and effect whatsoever. The charter does have a provision by which both a mayor and a city council can remove a general counsel through a supermajority vote. But this was not that. This was a non-binding resolution expressing concern of the city council that the general counsel was insufficiently independent.
And so, you notice that this was something that has, been part of an ongoing kind of series of disagreements between the Deegan administration and the council. I want to take a listen to one of her more vocal opponents, is Councilmember Rory Diamond, who represents the Beaches. He was talking here to our partners at News for Jax.
Everybody likes Mr. Fackler. I'm sure he's a very good lawyer, but he's lost the trust and confidence of his most important client, the Jacksonville City Council. So he simply can't keep doing that job if your client doesn't want you there. I believe that he's the mayor's lawyer and that he's doing whatever the mayor asks and not what the law requires or what city council might want. And you can't have an office of general counsel that is just essentially the lapdog of the mayor. And so I just can't accept that.
So, Chris, is there something to that? I mean, if a client doesn't trust their attorney, presumably they would get rid of their attorney. Now, obviously, this was non-binding, as you say. It didn't get a majority even of votes. But what action is possible for a city council member who doesn't feel like they're getting adequate representation from their attorney?
Well, there is again, and this is different than other attorney situations because, again, this is prescribed. There's a process prescribed in the charter for how a general counsel is selected and then how they can ultimately be removed. I mean, look, ultimately, I think it's probably a concerning situation for any attorney when a client, particularly one that's a significant a client as the city council, does vote to express this lack of confidence and independence. There can't be a removal, at least from the council side, unless, they can get a very significant number of votes, 15 votes, and that has to be based on a claim of malfeasance or misfeasance or an actual sort of violation of the law. So there's a very high bar actually for removal. I think what'll be important to track at this point is, are there efforts made to try and kind of help remedy this relationship going forward? Council has expressed its resolution. From their standpoint, has the ship truly sailed? And council does have the ability to go out and hire its own independent legislative counsel. Now, that council ultimately reports up to the general counsel, but council does have has the ability to hire its own legislative counsel, which is permitted. It'll be interesting to see if they kind of pursue that path. Also be interesting to see if there is an effort to sort of remedy this relationship going forward. But again, the bar to actually remove a general counsel under our charter is very high. It involves 15 votes only under certain circumstances. And after this vote on Tuesday, the mayor made it clear she supports Mr. Fackler. There doesn't seem to be any movement at the moment toward a change in that position. And for council to do it in an involuntary fashion, that would be a very high bar.
So some of the council members expressed concern that this could be a problem down the road, that this might send a message to future general counsels. Can you kind of explain what that concern might be?
Well, I think the one concern I heard was said publicly by Councilman Matt Carlucci, who essentially said, look, if we do this and we sort of force a general counsel to resign because we sort of disagree with their opinion, will that have a chilling effect on people who might want to hold the job of general counsel in the future? Look, it's a very difficult job, general counsel, because you are having to balance the interests of all of these different kind of parts of city government. And there are some times you have to make some very tough calls. I think a lot of that, probably the most effective general counsels over time, and Judge William Durden was the first one after consolidation. There's been a number of others. I think the most effective general counsels have been effective because they've been very good at communicating with, managing clients, trying to make sure they stay ahead of issues, that council members or other clients feel like they're accessible and they hear from them. So I think that's always a best practice for any lawyer in general. A good practice is stay in close touch with your clients, make sure they're aware of potential issues, make sure they know you're kind of proactively working on solutions. And I think that's the most effective general counsels have been really good at managing those client relationships, making sure that no one is ever surprised. I think that's been one of the concerns expressed here, that council members were surprised at times. by some of the OGC's opinions. So there are some best practices, but even in the best cases of scenarios, many general counsels have been subject to the claim that they favor, one branch of city government over the other. This isn't the first time we've heard this charge.
I want to dial back for just a moment with a question that we got on Facebook. It has to do with the proof of citizenship. And she's asking specifically about like a marital name change, whether women would need to bring a marriage license and a birth certificate if they've changed their names and they're trying to get proof of citizenship.
Yeah, that's actually been one of the concerns expressed about this potential executive order, which again is going to be challenged in court just because some of the constitutional issues I talked about. But, if someone is married and they change their name, suddenly the name that's on some of their documents, so that maybe even on their voter registration card, is going to be different than it is in some of their birth certificate and those kinds of things. So that is a concern that has been raised, how that is going to be sort of worked out over time if you have some of these rules in place. I know also a concern for elections officials around the country who have to manage this process. So we'll see more about that, but that has been a very important concern raised.
All right. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand. He is a local government, state government, actual all around government expert. He's an attorney here in Jacksonville, and he joins us once a month to help explain the nuances of what's going on behind the headlines. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937, or you can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. I do want to move on now to the issue of a rate hike at JEA. That's the city's municipal water and electric utility. This is coming at a time of a lot of concerns about inflation. What do we know about why this is coming now and what customers of the utility can expect?
Well, JEA has said, and they earlier this week, the board unanimously voted to increase rates. It'll be about 4% rate increase in 2025, maybe about 5% in 2026. And, JEA has said they need to do this to kind of handle the cost of operations, that particularly some of their plant building and management, because of different federal regulations, has become more expensive. Other prices have gone up, so they have to pass this on to the customer. Obviously, this is not going to be popular with JEA ratepayers, particularly given continuing inflation, perhaps even some enhanced inflation now because of some of what's happened in the last several months involving tariffs and other factors as well. So it's going to be very sort of unpopular. And I think we're going to see more discussion about this going forward because there's going to be a couple of vehicles for that discussion, particularly before the Jacksonville City Council. And as you know, just several weeks ago, the mayor's office announced they had reached a new accord with JEA. JEA each year, because JEA is a publicly owned utility, doesn't pay property taxes. So instead of that, they each year pay a payment in lieu of property taxes to the city of Jacksonville. And that's always a subject of negotiation and debate. That payment is going to go up significantly. From this year, it's about $124 million. Next year, it'll be $137 million. And in addition to that, JEA is going to, give the city an additional $40 million in this first year of what is a long-term agreement, about a 5-year agreement with the city. So there's a significant amount of money coming from JEA to the agreement. I think we've already seen some council members raise questions about this and whether there's a relationship between that and the rate hike. For example, this $40 million that JEA, this additional $40 million they're giving to the city this year, about $36 million of that is because JEA refinanced some debt. Was able to generate some money from that. Also, some enhanced revenues that JEA got from sales over the last year was about the other $4 million. So I suspect there's going to be some questions now. If JEA had this extra money to give to the city, why did they not use that instead to try and sort of mitigate rates for JEA ratepayers? Again, JEA may have very plausible explanations for that, but it is going to be, I think, a source of debate before the city council as we get into budget season and they begin to process this new JEA agreement.
And so you were saying, the rate increased 4% this year and then an additional 5% in fiscal year 2026. I think that they've estimated that would increase the average person's total bill from about $205 to about $221. Um, and it's, something that does tend to raise people's hackles when they do raise these rates. But, this is something that the mayor has said is going to be part of her configured budget estimates. I mean, we've talked previously about how this is a lower revenue year for the city and that they're going to have to be doing some belt tightening. Does this additional revenue from JEA make a measurable difference in that calculation?
It could, and we don't know what the latest council auditor projections. The city is almost definitely going to run a deficit of some kind this year. Last July, the city council auditor's office projected about an $80 million deficit for this year. And, the extra money from JA could certainly help mitigate whatever that final deficit is. And just to be clear, this is not something the current mayor's office invented. Multiple administrations over time have sought more money from JEA, which is the city's owned utility. So I don't want to leave the misimpression that this is the first time that a mayor has done this. Multiple administrations over time have sought more money from JEA. The timing might be a little tricky this time because of the money coming in and the JEA rate hike. But yeah, and I suspect that's part of the reason the administration tried to negotiate this extra money was to help mitigate some of this budget deficit the city's likely to face. Having been at City Hall during a 4-year period, 2011 to 2015, where the city really struggled with revenue, there are very painful choices that have to be made during those periods in terms of cuts of services. So it's traditional for administrations to try and find other sources of revenue that might help to sort of alleviate some of those potential cuts.
I want to take a call from John in St. John's. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. My question is in regards to the rate increase, or at least the proposed. I live in St. John's, and JEA serves St. John's, substantial space in St. John's, and that area is growing by leaps and bounds. So my question is, with that increase in revenue, and also in relation to the increases in salaries, especially the chief executive officer, which I believe they approved $750,000 of salary. If JEA have a rate increase for their expenses and salaries across the board, how that is affecting their revenue and expenses, and if that justifies their rate hike.
Thanks, John. And we've got just about a minute left, Chris.
Well, I think that's a question that will probably get some attention during this council process. The question that that John has raised. Another one might be, one of the justifications JEA gave for this rate hike is that they're having to do it because of tighter federal regulations among kind of their power plant construction and maintenance. If those rules change in a new administration, does that alleviate some of those concerns? So again, I think we have not heard the last of the discussion on this rate hike. As this process moves to city council, we're going to hear a lot more.
Chris Hand, thank you so much for being here. It's always a delight to talk to you.
Good to see you as always. See you next month, Ann.
All right. Thanks, Chris.